Atamarie, no mai, haere mai. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to this Financial Services Council political series breakfast, where today's focus topic is financial services and the climate crisis. In this content-rich session, our outstanding lineup of experts in the field will explore the risks and opportunities that climate change brings. Thank you for joining us. I'll be your MC today. I'm Vanya Thomas from Guardian Trust. This morning we're absolutely thrilled to be joined by Minister for Climate Change, the Honourable James Shaw. The Minister will give us some insights on the current state in an opening address, followed by a fireside chat with Richard Clippin, FSC CEO. And then attendees will hear from our panel of experts who will be tackling the big issues in a facilitated discussion. There will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the panel discussion. Just raise your hand and a mic will be brought to you. It's great to see so many people from across the financial services industry and a number of leading journalists in the room today. The session is being recorded and we are on the public record. And as well as a heap of expert insights, the session does carry CPD points and certificates will be emailed. So on COVID safety, if you haven't already scanned in, please use the COVID Tracer app to scan the QR code at the next opportunity. Turn on Bluetooth and, wash hands regularly, sanitise, leave space and stay safe. In regard to other housekeeping, please put phones on silent for complimentary Wi-Fi. The instructions and the login details are network, Cordis, password celebrate. Closest bathrooms are located in the Crystal pre-function area. Head up the stairs on your right as you exit the room. And emergency exits are on both sides of the room, clearly marked throughout the event floors, including the large brown doors and the stairway down to the ground floor. And in the event of an emergency, please do not use the lifts. Cordis staff will give instructions to guide you to the assembly point in City Road. And now to the program. So first, a scene-setting quote from former leader of the Green Party of Canada, Elizabeth May. At the end of the fossil fuel era, we are emerging to a new reality. We are ready to make the next leap, as momentous as abolishing slavery or giving women the vote. So we're here to talk about climate change and in particular the role of financial services, and there is so much to discuss. New Zealand, as we know, has joined others in declaring a climate emergency. There's the work of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, advice from the Climate Change Commission, the increasing focus on sustainable investments, and the growing spectre of climate change litigation risk, particularly as social values change. It's no longer simply an ethical issue. And because climate change presents a foreseeable risk of financial harm to so many businesses, the need to factor it in to risk management strategies is increasing. A 2019 New Zealand judgment confirmed that as a material financial risk, directors are accountable under care and diligence duties to take account of the financial consequences of climate change. And our court's expectations of reasonable care, diligence and skill will likely expand over time. But despite that key importance of the issue, there is no planet B, it's hard to achieve widespread and meaningful change. Maybe it feels too big of an issue to tackle, or maybe it's optimism bias or some other inherent human bias in really appreciating risk. And that's despite those powerful and pithy protest placards we've all seen, the snappy slogans which as well as conversations like this, help to raise awareness. Here's a slightly sanitised version of a compelling placard. Sticking your head in the sand is not a solution. Your backside will still get very hot. And another on the need to take action and personal responsibility. It's just one straw, said 8 billion people. And the need for a reality check, perhaps the best placard around. Are you fracking kidding me? And to get started, I'll hand over to Rob Flanagan, Chair of the Financial Service Council, who will take the stage to officially launch the event. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you, Vanya. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou kata. On behalf of the FSC board, I'd like to welcome you all here today. It's a great turnout, and there are a lot of people here outside the FSC membership, and you are very much welcome, and thank you very much for attending. This is part of our political Connect series, I suppose, with our politicians. And this isn't climate change. This is not a game. This is really important. This is something we have to do. And I just hope that all of you take it on board, that this is it shouldn't really be the start, but it is a start of a journey that we all must hit head on, solve the problems, and make us, make the whole environment a better place. So welcome. Thank you very much for attending, and I'll hand over to Richard to get to introduce speakers, etc. Thank you, Richard.
Morena, kia ora, good morning everybody, and echo Rob and Vanya's words with a very warm welcome. Fantastic to be here, and Minister, thank you for joining us and taking the time on this very important topic. Just thought I'd do one thing briefly just to set the scene. The FSC board, and this is a week old now, the FSC board last week signed off the FSC's new strategy, and I thought it would be valuable just to share it. In the room are many members, there are many guests, there are many key stakeholders that we work with, but wanted to bring the climate change discussion into why it's such an important topic for the financial services sector. At the top of the triangle, you'll see that the focus of the FSC is to help New Zealanders build their financial confidence and their well-being. And there's arguably nothing more important than the planet that we live on to make sure that happens. So it's not just a money conversation, it's a much wider and broader conversation. Of course, the piece that sits underneath that in orange is around being the voice of the sector, and in this room and outside of this room, and when we record, we will be going to the sector to try and represent their interests and making sure that we are on this topic with New Zealanders front and centre. And then the next part of the column is the three things that we come from, our intent areas, if you will. It's around lifting standards, it's around sustainability of the sector, and it's around making sure that there's good and strong outcomes for New Zealand consumers. It's a step change for the FSC. The top of the triangle is the step change. No longer will the FSC be a voice only for its members. It will be a voice of its members for the New Zealand community. And that took, whilst it's very simple words on a page, a very substantive and long discussion to make sure that was right. It was unanimous at the board, and it was a really good discussion as we went through. But I just thought it would be valuable to set that context in terms of all the things that you see us do, and in particular, the climate conversation. So with that, I'm going to hand you back to Vanya to introduce Minister Shaw. We absolutely appreciate you being here, Minister, and as Rob said, as part of our political series and raising the issues that I think unify us all in terms of where we're heading. So Vanya, back to you. Thank you.
Yes, and now it's my great pleasure to introduce the Honourable James Shaw, Minister for Climate Change and Associate Minister for the Environment. People want to hear from you, not me, so welcome, James Shaw.
Kia tau te rangamari o te rangi e tūnei, o papatua anuku e takoto nei, o te taio e awhenei, ki rangi e tātou, ti hei mauri ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki koutou, good morning. I think that photo was taken back in the days where we had to wear ties. Vanya, I had two personal favourites when it came to signs at the recent set of protests. One was a young woman carrying a sign saying, "I want a hot boyfriend, not a hot planet." but my favourite there was not normally a sign guy, but geez. As in, why are we still here? Look, I wanted to say thank you very much for getting up extremely early in the morning and then coming to the session and not the Prime Minister's one next door. I think I'll get to why in a minute, but I actually think that this community, the financial services community, is often overlooked in terms of the significance of the role that it has in the transition that's in front of us. And I don't underestimate it at all. And actually it's quite a high priority for me. And so I do very much appreciate the opportunity to spend the morning with you. We throw around the number 1.5 a lot, and I think we often don't reflect on why it is that we throw that number around a lot. In the grand scheme of the approximately 30 years of climate policy and international negotiations and various things that we've done, it has actually entered our parlance reasonably recently. Because it was codified in 2015 in the Paris Agreement. And it was a late addition. Everyone had been talking about 2 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. And then it was the small island states, led by the Caribbean and our own neighbours in the Pacific Islands, who fought a rearguard late action to ensure that that number, the 1.5, is in the Paris Agreement. And I think it can be easy to overlook why. Because that 0.5 degree of warming between 1.5 and 2 increases the severity and the likelihood of absolute catastrophe, particularly for those most vulnerable small island states, but actually for all of us as well. And there's a leading indicator of this, which is coral reefs. So we have lost approximately 50% of the coral reefs around the world already, just with what's happened to date. But the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is that at 1.5 degrees, the modelling suggests that we'll lose about 70% of the world's reefs, about half what's remaining. But at 2 degrees, it's over 90%. And that gives you a sense of the scale of just how sensitive things are and what can happen when you get those tipping points at relatively kind of small amounts when it comes to those global averages. And so that's why 1.5 degrees is bedded into our own legislation and why it's actually the purpose statement now of the Climate Change Response Act, which we modified through the Zero Carbon Act a couple of years ago. And everything flows from that. Because it's in the purpose of the Act, everything that is subsequent needs to serve the purpose of the purpose of the Act. And you can kind of forgive a lot of other flaws in our legislation or in our policy framework and so on and so forth, as long as it adds up to that. And this year is going to be absolutely pivotal in terms of demonstrating or not the extent to which our policy framework and our budget investments and all of that kind of stuff add up to what is required for New Zealand to do its part in terms of our share of living within that pathway. And the reason why this year is so critical, and I know that climate people say this year is critical every year, and to an extent that's true, but this year I really mean it, is because this year the government has to produce a emissions reduction plan in response to the Climate Change Commission's final advice due out in a couple of weeks' time. And the emissions reduction plan has to not just codify what those 5-year emissions budgets are going to be between now and 2035, but what are the policy choices that we have made, right? So we will have had to have made active cabinet decisions that we can demonstrate through the best modelling that we've got available, shows that we are actually on that path to fit within those emissions budgets. And I don't know, how much interaction you've had with government, but to have that tabled in Parliament by the 15th of December is a short period of time for a government. It's a short period of time for a government to do anything. But the emissions reduction plan has over a dozen lead ministers and several other supporting ministers, and about 30 different agencies who are involved in co-authoring it. And we want it not just to be a government plan, but a plan for the country. And so one of the things that we're doing is reaching out and working with industry, communities, iwi, to try and make sure to the maximum extent possible it's a plan for all of us, not just the government. Now, the importance of financial flows within all of this. I coincidentally, when I was in Paris, I was in opposition at that stage, and the Honourable Tim Grosser was New Zealand's Climate Change Minister, so he was off kind of in the negotiations with all of his counterparts. And I kind of wandered around the rest of the conference looking at things that happened to be interesting. And I walked into the back of a room, quite a large room, where Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England at the time, and Michael Bloomberg, were launching something called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And, these guys they're pretty dry, right? And the language that they use is the language of, the financial markets and the kind of, language that Reserve Bankers use. And one of the things that one of them said during the course of that is that it was their assessment that there were trillions of dollars of unquantified, unmanaged and undisclosed risk sitting on corporate balance sheets around the world relating to climate change, and that most directors would want to know that. And so their view was that we fairly rapidly need to move to a world where we had some level of disclosure around that in order for directors to actually get a sense of the true risks that their companies are exposed to, but also so that financial flows can make better decisions about their appetite for risk and where people want to deploy their capital. And when you consider the implications of that, just taking a risk view based on financial flows, you can see how that would make an enormous difference to our ability to live within a 1.5 degree threshold, because anything else actually ends up being a material risk for a business. Now, it may have an appetite for that risk, and that should be priced accordingly. But you can't do anything without good information. And so we, I'm very proud of this, became the first country to say that we would be moving to a mandatory climate-related financial disclosures regime. And I'm really pleased with my colleague David Clark, who is the relevant minister, who introduced that legislation just a few weeks ago. Now that's going to work its way through Select Committee. The XRB are working very hard on developing a set of standards that companies will be able to report to when we get to that point in time. And whilst we may be first, we are most definitely not alone. So I think the United Kingdom have committed to having a regime in place, I think within a year of ourselves. There is something like 60 different reserve banks around the world, central banks, who are actively considering it, because the community of reserve banks considers the scale of risk to be so significant that it can affect not just individual companies but the financial system itself. And so I think that you will start to see probably a fairly rapid rollout of the regime. But I think there are a number of those countries that are quite grateful to us because we are going first, and we will be able to show the way to the extent that what we do here is translatable anywhere else. And for that reason, it was really important to us that we did adopt the recommendations of Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg, because that way you get an emerging global system where you get transparency and comparability right around the world. So there are a few other things that we're working on. We set up in the last term of government New Zealand Green Investment Finance, which is essentially a direct investment house, but specialised in projects that get us to a low-carbon future. One of the things that we set that up with is we gave them probably the smallest possible amount of money that you can give to a direct investment house to be able to do anything, in order to try and get them to force the issue of galvanising private finance, because it's not, we don't want to displace the market here. We actually want to galvanise private finance towards the low carbon future, and we'll be obviously using that as one of our key tools in the future. But that has been quite significant in terms of just starting to get that market used to the idea that that's even a sector, because that was kind of a bit underdeveloped here. And I was really pleased to see a couple of weeks ago another private direct investment house get set up by Lance Wiggs and he did a capital raise a few weeks ago to try and sort of complement that. So you're starting to see the market responding there. And the last thing that I just wanted to refer to is changes to the emissions trading scheme. Because we're now starting to get something approaching a real price on carbon. It's sitting at about $37, $38 for the last several weeks. When I came into Parliament in 2015, I think that the price was about $2.50, and so you can see it's increased rapidly. I think actually that's not true because it was sitting at about $15 in 2015, but it's more than doubled in that last few years, and the trajectory, almost certainly, is for it to increase. And most people think about that purely as a liability, right? Like, okay, I've got to manage my liability, I've got to reduce the cost, But actually, when you think about it through the financial services lens, there's a whole sector of transition finance there, which we haven't really yet started to explore. Because, let's say for the sake of argument, I've got a large coal-fired, milk drying unit, and I want to get out of that, and the price today is $40, and I know at some point in the future it might be, for the sake of argument, $60. I'm not quite sure when, and I'm not quite sure if 60 is the number, but you can sort of see the trajectory. Then it makes far more sense to forward price that and to make that transition now than it does to wait until it gets really expensive in the future. But at the moment, the number of companies that can see that are saying, well, I don't really have the working capital to make that investment. I mean, a milk drying unit's a pretty expensive piece of kit. This one went in, frankly, not all that long ago, so it's not yet at the end of its life. So how do I finance that? And I think that the financial services sector has an opportunity there to say, well, we can help with that, because basically any scenario where you've got a rising price like that and a liability that you can reduce through new technology suggests that there should be a way through, and that both the company and whether it's your bank or your institutional investors or whatever should be able to support that. And so I think that there is, I guess, a whole new world of financial products available to be offered into the marketplace to assist all of us to make this really quite colossal scale transition over the course of the next few years. And I know that there will be people on the panel shortly who are far more qualified to dig into that than I am. And so with that, I will say again, thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the rest of our kōrero this morning. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Kia ora, Minister Shaw. Thank you so much for that inspiring ministerial keynote, and I would just like to say on behalf of FSC and our audience here today, homai te paki paki, a round of applause. Thank you very much. And now it's my pleasure to invite the panel to the stage, because I'm sure that they are going to be just itching to talk to us about those mandatory TCFD disclosures in the emissions trading scheme and transition finance. So please come to the stage, Joanna and Jenny and Lloyd and Minister Shaw with Richard Griffin.
Sorry, we might just have the fireside chat first with the Minister, and then we'll go to the panel. Minister, if you'd like to join on the fireside. Thanks for those comments. There's a question I've been dwelling on now for the last couple of weeks, which is this climate conversation feels like an existential crisis. And it kind of feels like when that turns up, you're either really clear on action or you kind of spin your wheels and you go round and round in circles. I'm kind of interested in your perspective on that, and kind of how did you get to the point of conviction and then clarity about where you kind of wanted to head on the discussion and make it kind of your life's work?
There's a lot to that. So I fall into the camp that says yes, this is an existential crisis, and not just for coral reefs. When you consider the scale of what that kind of ecological breakdown means for human society, it'll make COVID look like a walk in the park. And the comparison with COVID's a really interesting one, right? Because I think that humans are very well designed to deal with a clear and present danger, right? That's just sort of a function of, many years of evolution where with a threat that we can see that's right in front of us, we've got an inbuilt ability to respond and to respond well. It's just a survival mechanism. But we're hopelessly designed to deal with a slow-moving, distributed, largely invisible threat. And so we really only respond when the consequences start to be felt, right? So when there's a flood or a fire or a drought or a storm or something like that, and we kind of go, oh, this is bad. And so you're starting to see, now that you're starting to see those consequences occurring at different speeds and manifesting differently in different parts of the world, actually I think that's where the pressure is starting to build. That's not a good thing, of course, but it's better to respond than not respond. I actually had quite a sort of a weird, and in fact I had an introduction to climate change largely through the financial services sector, because I was working at Pricewaterhouse in London in the late 1990s, and I would have described myself as a general purpose environmentalist, right? So I was into kind of whales and oceans and lots of things. And I was reading an insurance industry report in I think 98 or 9 that estimated that by the year 2050 the insurance sector would have disappeared under the weight of climate change related claims. And I thought, well, that's dramatic. Why isn't everybody running around panicking about this? And it's because of that difference. And, you read a report and you think, oh, well, but 2050 feels like a very long way away. It feels a lot less a long way away than it did in 1998.
It's interesting that comment you raise about COVID and the present danger and kind of action, complete community action, team of 5 million, and you can kind of see when it goes pear-shaped that you completely lose control. What do you think are the lessons in terms of how we communicate the message, the warning systems, the fact that it is life and death, although at 30 and 50 years, it's not for everyone. So, yeah, I'm kind of interested in how COVID's informed your thinking on that.
Yeah, look, I think that we're really bad at climate change-related communications, and it is something that I think that if we're going to bring everyone along the way that we did with COVID, that we need to have a comprehensive communications program for the way that we did and do with COVID. And there was that moment when we went into lockdown in March of last year. The timing of that was really important because on the one hand you had the exponential curve where 1 week you've got 7 cases and then 3 weeks later you've got 2,000, and we were getting all that modelling coming through from Rodney Jones, who'd kind of looked at all of the other countries where it had taken off, and he said basically once you get past about 8 cases, then you're on the train and it's hard to get off at that point. So and we had so few cases, but because we had so few cases, no one was panicking. So we, in addition to listening to the epidemiologists, you had to listen to the sociologists, because the sociologists are saying you kind of need to just hold it till a moment when the population at large perceives the risk to be great enough to comply with an order to go and live at home for a month, right? And you can see what happened in other countries where they had real compliance issues, is it really got away from them. And so the tension there was kind of getting that moment right, but not waiting so long that actually it gets away from you. And that window was probably about 72 hours. And I think we just managed to get the bullseye, but we were pretty lucky with that. And I think when you sort of think about that, you kind of go, well, how do you extrapolate that thinking to something like climate change, where you know that you need a level of social cohesion and not just awareness, but like a real buy-in to another team of 5 million effort, but one that's going to take decades rather than weeks.
So that's a nice segue into the kind of specific question around climate change and a climate-friendly economy is going to mean there's significant winners and losers. I don't like to use those terms, but there'll be opportunities for some, and to your milk analogy earlier, there'll be costs for others. How do we and it's a transition. How do we transition? How do we bring the sectors that are going to struggle along, who might be taking the Vanya's analogy of, you put your head in the sand, but you're still going to get your butt burnt?
Finance. And I'm not being disingenuous just because I'm in this room, but the way for, to be a bit cute about it, everyone to be a winner, is to work out how to finance the transition. So I'll take the milk drying unit, for example. So Synlait, a few years ago, when the ETS unit price was about $20, made the call that their next boiler would be an electrode boiler rather than a coal or gas boiler down in Canterbury. And at $20, that makes no sense at all, right? But that asset's got about roughly a 30-year life to it. And so, it doesn't take a genius to work out that within the 30-year life of that brand new unit, the ETS unit price was going to sail above $40. And at 40, I think they said, I might have this wrong, but I think they were saying that at $40, it sort of kind of washes its face. It starts to make even. Once the ETS price gets north of that, then basically you're making money on it. Now, they didn't know when it was going to get to $40, but it turned out to be a lot sooner than they thought, which makes that choice look very smart right now, And so they were kind of using that sort of forward pricing. But the question is, who's their banker? Who's helping them to get there? To take it to a more retail level, one of the things that the Climate Change Commission said with their draft advice is that in their estimation, if you can work out the lifetime cost of an electric vehicle over an internal combustion engine vehicle, a family will save about $7,000. Now, the narrative about EVs is that no one's buying them because the upfront cost is really expensive. Well, that's a finance question. It's not a technology question or anything like that. That's a finance question. How do you price the lifetime cost of an internal combustion engine vehicle compared to an EV and then have the customer pay that rather than do what we normally do, which is go out and buy a really cheap second hand that has really high running costs in both fuel and maintenance because, all of our financing is focused on the capital cost, not the operational cost.
Because it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, the other thing I was dwelling on was, who's driving the change? Is it going to be businesses that take a decision, I'm only going to manufacture EVs, or is it consumers walking in, making a decision at buying time going, actually, I'm only going to look at EVs? And I kind of wonder, how do we bring the consumer's wallet to the table every time there's a decision that's kind of a material planet-related question?
Well, ultimately, it turns out the Greenies might have been right about this one. But this notion of pricing the externalities actually means making those costs visible. And with things like an ETS price or a waste levy or things like that, that's kind of a blunt instrument way of doing it, but it's kind of about as good as we've got. But I think with where the sector's now getting to, with some of the things like the risk-related reporting and therefore pricing, that you'll start to see those things become a lot more sophisticated and actually economy-wide rather than just kind of sector-specific, the way that some of these other instruments are applied. And so, I think, if we get it right, then a car manufacturer will send a price signal to their customer because they'll say, well, we can sell you an EV, but or an internal combustion engine vehicle, but my investors are pricing the manufacture of internal combustion engine vehicles quite high, so my cost of capital is really high for that, and therefore the cost to you is quite high, and that'll start to switch the equation that you've got at the moment. I mean, there are loads of other factors, of course, right? You've got simply the scale of production and supply chain issues and all that kind of jazz, which drive the relative cost differential at the moment. But cost of capital will be one of them in the not too distant future.
It'd be interesting to explore that with the panel because at the end of the day, the boards of the companies who are manufacturing whatever they are have to be being held to account, if you will, about the investment decision. So we will pick that up. Look, I'm also mindful that there may be some questions in the audience. I've got a couple of last ones for you. We might then go to the panel and then open some of the discussion to the audience. Budget on next week. How does the government spending help drive this agenda, accelerate what we're trying to do more broadly in the climate space?
Well, I mean, the first rule of budget is you don't talk about budget, of course, but so there are, I mean, basically there's, a number of levers available to government, right? Regulation being one and investment being another. And, we made a decision with Green Investment Finance, for example, to say, well, we'll put a bit of risk capital up, essentially, and create a structure and try and use that as a sort of an icebreaker vehicle for the sector and see if we can try and galvanise some change there. And, it's because it's new and the experience of looking at other green banks around the world has been very, very similar. It takes a long time to get going, but then it really gets some momentum. And I kind of get the sense that they're kind of on that, that part of the curve now. And so there's that. There's things like, I just announced that we're buying 422 EVs for the government fleet. We've got about 15,500 to go, but we're starting to place bulk orders at a discount rate, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to team up with some in the corporate sector who want to shift their fleets as well. And we've shortened the horizon that those vehicles are staying in the government fleet, so that they can then move into the second-hand market, which is, of course, where all of us get our things. So we're starting to use our purchasing power to drive kind of outcomes beyond simply lowest cost, which has been the kind of historical norm in government. And cost is obviously one of the drivers, but it's now not the only one. We're trying to say, well, how can we use this as a multiplier effect? Because you've got to remember, we buy about $42 billion worth of goods and services every year. So if we did that through a climate lens, that would be helpful in terms of helping to shift other sectors of the economy and create some scale.
So that's probably my last question, which is kind of this whole of government approach. And, with COVID, it's been interesting to see if there were any gaps, how did they occur? And was it because, Department A and Department B weren't aligned, for example? With the climate conversation, which is now going to be a sustainable discussion, how do we make sure that there is a whole of government message, that everyone kind of sings from the same song sheet and it's all lined up so people get really clear guidance, direction, leadership, and so on?
Just trying to work out how many journalists there are in the room. Well, so when we declared the climate emergency, if you look at the cabinet paper that accompanied that, there's some really strong language about saying, we're declaring a climate change emergency. It's not the same thing as a civil defence emergency, but it causes civil defence emergencies, and therefore we have to treat it at the same order of magnitude as if it was a civil defence emergency, and that therefore government needs to respond with something at the scale and sufficiency and comprehensiveness that the challenge requires. And so that is, that's a cabinet decision. So it therefore applies across all of government. But I will say it's unevenly distributed. And so different agencies, I think, are in quite different places. But, the effort that we're going to this year with the emissions reduction plan, like I said, I think, because we've got to get all of the different sectors lined up and all the different agencies lined up to be able to publish that. And that's going to require, more effort from some than others.
Look, really appreciate you kind of rolling with the questions. I think it absolutely is time now to invite the panel up. If we can perhaps go to that slide, and delighted to welcome Jenny, Joanna, and Lloyd to the platform. We'll get you some mics. I'll just move down the end here. Sorry, Joanna. Folks, I'm not going to welcome the panel in terms of their bios and so on. What we thought would be a really useful way to do is to put who they are and where they're from and what their roles are up on the slide, and perhaps ask them the first question, just to, as I did to the Minister, around their background, their perspective, and kind of their passion for this area. And Jenny, I might start with you if that's all right.
Sure. Is this on? It is? Yep, great. Kia ora koutou. I'm Jenny Cooper. I guess I come to this conversation with two hats. The first is that I am a commercial barrister. I do litigation and advisory work in the sort of commercial corporate area, including in financial services and regulation. And so that's my background. Much more recently, though, I've also become a bit of a climate activist. I'm the president of Lawyers for Climate Action NZ. And that group was set up about 2 years ago. And the prompt for it, for me at least, was reading the IPCC's 2018 report on 1.5 degrees. And so I'm really glad that the Minister chose to emphasise the importance of 1.5 degrees, because I think, you know, the conversation in this country and globally, I think, has really changed dramatically in the years since that report was released. And I think now we're seeing much more awareness of climate change as a real issue that's impacting everybody. But I think what is still perhaps missing sometimes is we're sort of all on board for zero carbon by 2050, but I don't think that everyone is, you know, perhaps there isn't a widespread awareness of the importance of how we get there. And 2030 and keeping warming to 1.5 degrees really means a focus on what we do between now and 2030 is critical. So I'm glad that the Minister emphasised that. Coming back to, I guess, the two hats I wear in this conversation. I think the common thread between them is really regulation and enforcement. And I certainly am a strong believer that we need good regulation to create, to overcome the market failure and regulatory failure that has got us to where we are with climate change. And certainly TCFD and disclosure is a really important part of that. But equally, we need to see the rules being enforced to create a level playing field, and we need to see really good enforcement. And so I guess that's where the litigation side comes in.
Awesome. Thanks, Jenny. Joanna.
Thanks, Richard.
Welcome.
Thank you. So my name's Joanna Silver, and I head up the Sustainable Finance team at Westpac. And we take a very holistic and integrated approach to sustainability and climate risk at Westpac. We've recently released a couple of weeks ago our 2025 sustainability strategy, Hero Ringa Ringa Manaki, so many hands working together. We still have climate change as a core focus in that strategy. Really three main components to that: reducing our own emissions, managing and reporting on our own climate risk, which of course includes our lending portfolio, and we've recently put out a $10 billion sustainable finance target. So fundamentally, every day our team is engaging with our institutional business customers about their sustainability strategy and how they can align their financing to that, with climate being the core focus for all of those customers. So this really involves sharing our insights on, the trends driving a stronger focus on climate globally and nationally, how they're performing compared to their peers locally and globally, both on climate risk management and sustainability, but also on sustainable finance. And then finally, it was just really sharing with them the role that finance can play in accelerating their transition. So whether it's green bonds, sustainability-linked loans, broadly transition finance that James alluded to before.
Awesome, thank you. And Lloyd, last word to you in terms of the intros.
Thank you. I'm Lloyd Kavanagh. I'm a Senior Banking and Financial Services Partner at MinterEllisonRuddWatts. My involvement and great interest in this topic really started about 5 years ago, maybe a little more than that, working with my colleagues from our Australian sister firm who've been market leaders on the implications for fiduciary duties for company directors and fund managers. They were the instructing lawyers behind the famous Senior Counsel opinions in Australia. And I got asked because the person I work with couldn't go to Tokyo for a UN EPFI regional congress on the topic of exposure of managed funds to climate risk. So I did my homework and came up to speed and went to speak. And what I realised was New Zealand, this is 2017, was way behind people from places like Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore on this topic. And the specific angle, which the Minister alluded to, is the same journey. TCFD was actually generated by the G20 because they were worried that fund managers and bankers and the business community did not realise they had a ticking time bomb in their portfolios akin to the magnitude of the GFC. And so they said, okay, we'll start recommending that people investigate how they will be impacted, not how they're going to impact the planet, and then they'll at least start to manage for that. And it's great that New Zealand is now the first mandatory approach, but it's a pretty narrow scope, Minister, if I may say that. Big call out for me is there's a lot of government sector who are exposed that I really would like to see also reporting on the same basis alongside listed companies and the big financial sector as role models. That's, I guess, my challenge.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lloyd. Folks, we thought we'd run this discussion in three parts. The first part, we'll get into the is business risk, climate risk, the kind of risk discussion. The second part, we'll jump into the financing piece. There are a lot of KiwiSaver providers and investment houses in the room, so we'll jump into that. And the third part, we'll talk about the outlook and cause for optimism or pessimism or what needs to change. So, Joanna, I might go to you first on that question of, is business risk climate risk? And if it is, what are the implications of that?
It absolutely is. That's how we see it at Westpac, and that's certainly how our customers are starting to see it. Most people think about the physical risks of climate change, and then if they've looked into those, they might have worked out some of the transition risks in terms of moving to a less polluting, greener economy and what that might mean from a regulatory policy, even litigation risk perspective. And then the financial impacts of that, so production disruptions, supply chain disruptions, etc. And this all fundamentally flows through to the value of your investments and your assets, which is what's been touched on already. I guess the way we see it is that, not only are there real world, legal and economic implications for climate risk, but being aware that we're part of a global supply chain, whether that's the supply of capital from investors or getting your products out to market. Whether it's BlackRock deciding not to invest in a particular listed entity because it hasn't properly managed those climate risks and the directors aren't awake to those, or not being able to get capital into your business. So, I think the approach we're taking at Westpac is that we really need to get our New Zealand businesses to adapt to the global drivers. The transformation that we need in the economy here is quite profound. It's not going to be easy. We're going to need grit and determination and tenacity. It's a complicated and systemic issue, and therefore we've got to tackle it from a lot of different angles. But we really have the view that if we want those supply chains of capitals and market access to remain open to us, then we need to be awake to and be transparently managing and understanding those climate risks. So yes, the climate risk is fundamentally business risk.
Fantastic.
It's not just a risk though, Richard. There are also great opportunities here. You referred to BlackRock not investing. The flip side is if you take a company like Meridian Energy in New Zealand, who's been voluntarily doing TCFD type disclosure for a couple of years, BlackRock's Sustainable Investment Fund filed a substantial financial product holding notice, meaning they've got over 5% some months back, and I suspect those two things are not disconnected. So if you embrace these things, you will see a lower cost of capital. There are also business opportunities in any disruption, of course. And so those businesses who move faster and are more adaptable and find those opportunities using New Zealand's great strengths, one of which is we have a higher proportion of sustainable energy generation than anybody else. Those businesses finding those opportunities are going to prosper. And the key, I think, for the fund managers in the room is, and I know some of you are already doing this, looking through and picking who are going to be those folks who are going to thrive in a changing world.
Thanks, Lloyd. Jenny, any comments on this particular topic?
Yeah, I completely agree. Obviously, it is a business risk, and it's increasingly the business risk. I think. And Joanna touched on litigation risk. That's obviously going to be a critical factor, which I can comment more on. But no, I completely agree with the other panelists.
So why don't we head there? Because I think this question around roles of directors, roles of governance, kind of managing the risk side, and then maybe we'll jump into that. And what happens if it all goes wrong, or what happens if there was an investment in your portfolio and you didn't know? So maybe can we just pick up on the governance piece? If you're a director, what are the issues sitting in this room today that really should be front and centre?
Sure. Well, look, Lloyd made reference to some of the Australian advice on this issue, which has since been picked up in New Zealand as well, and many of you will have seen the Aotearoa Circle opinion. But as Vanya said in her introduction, directors' duties and trustee duties have quite sort of broad, malleable concepts, and our expectations of what directors and trustees need to do and fiduciaries need to do does evolve and is evolving, I think. So as climate risk becomes sort of an increasing part of every aspect of our lives, we're going to be expecting the people who look after our money and the people who run our companies to be really across that and to be making decisions based on that. And I think also potentially what we may see, and there's already quite a lot of discussion about, is a broader concept of what are the best duties of the company, what are the best duties of investors, in the best interests of investors, and seeing those interests as not purely financial, but actually also incorporating well-being, because you can get great returns, but it's not going to do you much good if the planet is uninhabitable. So I do think we are starting to see, and will continue to see, a lot of change in that area. And perhaps one comparison is the flood of litigation we saw following the GFC, and a lot of claims against directors. And we did see new emphasis on directors' duties in that context. And of course, all those cases get determined with the benefit of hindsight to a certain extent, even though, of course, the judges say they're not using hindsight. But it's easy after an event has occurred to say, well, you should have seen that coming. Yeah.
Jenny, can you just, we were talking in the briefing earlier in the week just around some of the litigation. So can you maybe touch on a couple of the key cases and what kind of happened and what went wrong, what went right out of that?
Sure. Well, we are seeing obviously an increasing trend towards climate litigation around the world. The biggest venue for that is the US, not surprisingly perhaps, but I think what we need to take note of is the second biggest is Australia. So there have been around 100 climate-related cases in Australia so far. And they cover a really broad range, but the ones that I'm personally most interested in are the ones brought by shareholders and investors. And so probably the first really interesting one there was Abrams and CBA, where some shareholders took CBA to court over its failure to disclose climate risk. And that ended up being settled essentially by CBA agreeing to give the disclosure in its annual reports, which it now does. And essentially they adopted a TCFD style framework, so what we'll be seeing here. A second really interesting one is McVeigh and Rest. So that was a superannuation scheme participant sued the trustee of a superannuation scheme for failing to disclose what they were doing to manage climate risk in their portfolio. Again, that was settled with them essentially agreeing to give the disclosure and to start managing that risk. So we're seeing what we have seen then in that sort of litigation is shareholders and investors sort of calling on entities to disclose and to manage. And I think the next big wave, as I say, is likely to be claims for damages for loss. And we haven't seen that yet because we haven't perhaps seen the big shocks in impacting on asset values. But at some stage, I'm sure those will occur. And that's where I think the big class action litigation is likely to come.
I think one of the interesting things to reflect on is, again, there are some things that people can do now that protect themselves and their businesses. I heard a really compelling presentation to the chairs of audit committees through the IOD about 2 years ago from someone from one of the accounting firms who was pointing out that if you wanted to protect yourself, and I don't think this is just directors, this is fund managers as well, of a claim in 10 years' time when that event that Jenny's alluding to starts to manifest is to voluntarily adopt the TCFD type methodology, because at the end, it's just good hygiene, right? It's making sure that your governing body has the capability to understand and identify risks and opportunities that you're subject to, that you then analyse the risks and also the opportunities, and you establish some metrics and report against them. And so this is not some kind of tick box compliance effort. This is actually the core of good governance for a fund manager, for a bank, for actually any business, whether they happen to be listed or not. And it's actually a path where in 10 years' time where someone's having a crack, because of course you can't guarantee that you won't have a problem, you can say, well, of course, we were doing the right thing. We identified there were risks. Risks, you can't always prevent risks manifesting themselves, but you can take reasonable steps to manage. So that's where I really encourage people to not just think about this, the standard that's coming as an obligation for some. Actually, it's a useful tool, and I think litigators in future will say, even to those who weren't mandatorily required to apply the standard, how else, if you didn't apply it, what else were you doing?
Well, and you've got to hope that the banks have a really important role there as well, but they won't lend if you're not doing that.
And that's one of the risks for, I think the listed community will be forced to wake up to that, but I worry about privately held businesses who one day rock up to their bank and find that their bank's part of the recently announced Net Zero Bankers Alliance globally, and guess what? We just don't want your loan on our book because it's exposing us to risk we don't want.
I'm just going to say that, so that's actually already happening. There's a coal mining company with operations down on the West Coast that can't open an account. Their existing account holder said, actually, we're good, thanks. And then I think they had somebody else lined up, and then they kind of said the same thing, and so they actually can't even run a bank account for their business in New Zealand now, because essentially the banking sector's just gone, I'm sorry, coal's just way too high risk for us. We're not interested.
Minister, I'm going to ask you the last word on this particular topic, and then we're going to go to the floor. So if you do have a question, we do have some mics around. Just let us know, and we'll go after this to the question. But just close out, this is business risk, climate risk, and to the discussion is business opportunity, climate opportunity. I wonder if you could kind of wrap that with any closing thoughts around the role of boardrooms, the role of businesses to drive and manage the risk, but also to drive and manage the opportunities.
Well, I think it's been pretty well covered and quite articulately. But the thing that I keep saying is I think that this is, to coin a phrase, an amazing time to be alive, because we're about to essentially induce the single largest upgrade to our economy across the entire economy that we've seen in a very long time. And we should think about it as an opportunity to upgrade in terms of productivity. We've got very poor productivity performance, and lots of other issues in our economy as well. And I think if we view it through that lens, there's a correlation between the kinds of things that you need to do to de-risk your business and from a climate lens, but also upgrade your business in terms of productivity, better connection with your customers, innovation and new technology, new products and services, better governance, actually, because you're looking at parts of the business that you might have overlooked if you hadn't had access to that kind of information. So I think it's a fantastic time. And I just wanted to give Lloyd some good news as well, because in November we said that we were committing the public service to become carbon neutral by 2025, and the nature of that is you can't offset, at least initially. The idea is we really want to drive down our gross emissions to the maximum extent possible, and then essentially anything that we haven't gotten out of the system by 2025 we'll start offsetting until we have driven it out of the system. But the first step to that is measurement, management and reporting, and so obviously a public entity, a ministry is a very different entity from a listed company, and so the nature of the reporting requirements and the governance requirements will be different, but there will be a lot of similarities, particularly in terms of risk assessment and the scenarios that you use to underpin that and so on. And we've got to do that across, I think, something like 100 agencies over the course of the coming years. And there's not a lot of capability anywhere in the country, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector as well, which is one of the reasons we started with a narrow scope. Is because actually you kind of say, well, where do you most need it soonest? And let's start there, build that capability. And then I think as it becomes more kind of business as usual, and we develop a pool of people in the country who kind of know how to do the stuff, have got a few years of doing it under their belt, then you start to, that talent then becomes fungible as well between the private sector and the public sector, or different parts of the private sector, whether it's in the mandatory or in the voluntary sectors.
Awesome, yeah, great. Thank you for that, because we were going to head down that. When do the beyond top 200 kind of come into scope and government agencies? So awesome, folks. Questions from the floor. Opportunity to ask. Also, a fantastic panel. We got a question just back here. If you wouldn't mind letting us know who you are and who your question's to, that'd be great.
Murray Parish to James Shaw. Will the OG Fibre Solutions? Will the direct regulation of process heat under the RMA destabilise the carbon market and investment flows, in your view?
No, I don't think it will. I'd be interested in reading your submission on it.
We're doing it now.
If you think that it will. No, and I think that the reason is because then there is a bit of a public debate occurring around the margins at the moment between the extent to which you want to rely on your ETS price to drive change versus what's kind of broadly called complementary measures, which include direct investment, regulation, and so on. And actually, you kind of need both. So a price by itself won't actually get you the change you need. And I guess I'll use a very different analogy for that is in the domain of transport, for example. A rising ETS price will affect the price of petrol, but if people don't have access to either a non-petrol driven vehicle or cycleways or buses or light rail or whatever, then all that does is it increases prices without giving the ability to switch. And so things like the what you're talking about, the regulation of process heat and some of those kinds of components is what I would describe as a complementary measure to the price point.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the question. We got a question just here on the front table, and we got a question on the back table. If we've got a microphone, Riss, we might just go to that table.
Hi, Richard. I'm Rebecca Sellers, and I have a question for the Minister, please. Minister, I'm sorry, happy to stand up. I'm right back here. We met at the breakfast table, Minister. My question concerns the bill that's currently before Parliament. It has some really, you're right that it's great that New Zealand's leading the way, but the bill has some really strong penalties in for directors in terms of their liability for financial disclosure. It's great that we're having this conversation around opportunities, and I think a number of people here see climate risk as part of broader conduct risk. And I'm wondering, Minister, if there's any room for the FMA to take a lighter approach to enforcement to begin with, or give any message, because I think it's really important that directors feel brave and able to make meaningful disclosure right from the beginning and use the opportunity to have a meaningful discussion around climate risk rather than the fear of compliance and the fear, I think, as Jenny would perhaps invoke in them, of class litigation.
So I'll say a couple of framing pieces. First of all, David Clark is the minister responsible for the legislation because it falls into his portfolio. So I'd encourage you to get in touch with him. But also obviously the select committee process is now underway or will be underway shortly, and so you should bring those concerns there. The other thing that I would encourage is to have that conversation with the XRB, right, who are sort of working on developing the standard, but they are also informing the select committee process as well about what they think that how you kind of handle that sort of transition. And I would agree with you. I think that we broad in principle I would agree with you. Because I don't want to mess with the select committee process. That's a parliamentary process. But the idea is that at the moment we have very little capability anywhere in the country. There are a few companies like Westpac and Meridian and others who have kind of voluntarily done this, but it's a very small pool of people. And what we want to get to is fairly quickly a very large pool of people who have got that sort of level of experience. And so we started with the principle of saying it's a sort of a comply or explain type regime, where you start with the principle that we have to do it, you investigate your levels of risk, and then you explain why you think it doesn't apply to you as well. And somewhere in there might be a solution to the issue that you're looking at. But how that gets manifested in legislation is kind of outside my lane, shall we say.
I'm going to keep us moving. I feel like some of the panel want to jump in, but go, Jenny.
Well, look, you're right. I've looked at the bill and I was quite surprised to see the level of criminal liability. But having, as the Minister said, it's a draft, it's a bill, it's going through select committee, so there's opportunities for submissions and for that to be looked at. But I guess the other thing to note, though, is the criminal liability only attaches if there's a knowing breach. And so the way to avoid liability is to be, avoiding the issue is not a way to avoid liability. You need to engage with that. And also just to say, there's probably people from the FME here, but they do have a sort of a sliding scale approach to enforcement. So not everything goes straight to the top.
Awesome, thank you. We're going to have one last question. I'm really mindful of time as well. On this table.
Hi there, my name is Simon Haynes. I'm the chair of the Boutique Investment Group. Now, just from a fund manager perspective, the easiest thing in the world is to offload your liability. You could just put in a very simple ban, I'm not doing this. Suddenly, filling out your reports becomes very easy. You've got rid of your liability. But the truth is you haven't actually done anything that's beneficial in the world. Actually doing right might be actually being in some of those bad companies and supporting their transition. I suppose one of my fears is in the way that we're drafting the legislation and in this world of media sound bites, it's actually becoming harder and harder to actually do the right thing versus being seen to do the right thing. It seems to me those two things are almost pulling you in opposite directions. And I suppose it's interesting that the panel includes lawyers because of the offloading of liability. So I guess, what are your comments around that?
Anyone want to grab hold of that?
Yeah. Just from the bank side.
Thanks, Song.
The same way that carbon leakage is a risk, so too is capital leakage. So, yes, some of the fund managers or even the banks could take the view that no, we're just outright not going to fund that. And in some instances we have. But our view is that we need to work with our customers to help them see and understand the risks and then see and understand the opportunities. And I think the role that the financial services sector can play is really understanding that the rise in ESG is making money managers focus a lot more strongly on sustainability. But at the same time, we are still pretty focused on short-termism. That's something the Aotearoa Circle has really brought forward. Interestingly, McKinsey found that the loss to the S&P 500 because of short-termism just in 1 year was about 79 billion in returns. But then conversely, companies that have a long-term approach, I think the McKinsey article I read said have a 47% stronger cumulative revenue growth than those that don't. And certainly Morningstar's found that sustainability indices perform better than benchmark. So I guess the questions that you can be asking, your potential investment opportunities in terms of your portfolio construction can centre less around are you going to beat those particular quarterly or half-yearly forecasts to perhaps, how is the crisis informing informed your strategic planning and what sort of strategic opportunities are you seeing. Some of our heaviest emitting customers on our books are the ones who are most awake to this, and we see it as an incredibly important role that we can play as one of the largest providers of capital in the economy, in the banking sector, is to help finance their transition and help test and develop and really bring forward certain aspects of their climate transition strategy and align financing to it, which is why you're seeing an increase in engagement of both diversity of sectors in sustainable finance and also in structures. So where 3 years ago it was just around green bonds on the debt side, you're now seeing sustainability linked instruments where companies who may or may not have a particular green asset base, but they understand the risks, they've got a very strong, coherent, integrated sustainability strategy, and they're willing to put long-term and short-term targets in place. Sometimes in the case of a loan tenor, it's only a 3-year target. But when we need to be getting net zero, actually a heck of a lot sooner than 2050, by the way, it's probably about 2030, the next 3 years can be incredibly important for a business. So putting ambitious and material and meaningful targets in place and attaching your cost of borrowing to those is quite important. And while it might only be basis points, when it's a $50 or $100 million loan, that's an FTE in a business. So I think that just we do need to engage those bigger emitting customers on that transition journey and support them through it, and then hold them to account if they're not awake to it or if they don't invest, which is where, mandating disclosure of that climate risk, and even some of the sustainable finance structures now are recommending disclosure around proportion of CapEx and OpEx towards climate transition. So transparency is an incredibly powerful thematic here.
Because Joanna, I'll come to you just in a moment, because Joanna, that's Westpac and the banks and the KiwiSaver providers are really at the front line of this, right? At those customer interactions. Has Westpac built a kind of a systemic way to raise those conversations, to identify the big players, to kind of talk to boards and so on around what their transition plans are?
Yeah, it's a multi-prong approach. So we were one of the first banks to set up a sustainable finance team, essentially a cost centre. But our role is to have those conversations with those customers directly. We were also very engaged with the Sustainable Finance Forum within the Aotearoa Circle, the leadership on the Sustainable Business Council, etc. And then also looking over the next 12 months at how we can align our lending portfolio to 1.5 degrees, and those sorts of conversations that we need to have with particular customers.
Thank you.
Richard, just to pick up on some of that, and a little shout out for the FSC's working group on the submissions that we're going to be doing on climate related financial disclosure. What we're finding is there's a huge gap in terms of the data. So what I mean by that is, yes, we can get some global data about the physical climate changes in various scenarios, and NIWA do some work, but what I hear from people who are scientists and engineers, not nearly enough. But what we're missing from government at the moment is projections in scenarios, without picking whether we're going to be 1.5 or 5, what's going to be happening with the transitional impacts in the economy. So I think you may well observe, because I take your point, you're not the responsible minister, submissions being made calling for agencies like MB and Treasury to start publishing the data to allow people to comply with the standards that the XRB are going to produce, particularly those smaller companies who don't have whole banks of internal economists and scientists and engineers to generate the data for themselves. So that may be something you see the private sector calling for.
Thanks a lot, folks. I'm going to just wrap with one last question to each of the panellists. It's now, we're sitting on this panel in 2030. What's new, what's changed, how well are we going? Minister, I might start with you on this one, and Joanna, finish with you if that's all right.
Well, I don't think I'll be in this job in 2030. Well, I think, look, there's a kind of a sort of a simple answer to that, and then there's a complex answer, and the simple answer is that the world will have changed, right? And it will, it'll have changed in ways that are bad, and it'll have changed in ways that are good. But one of the ways that it will have changed in a way that will be good is that what we are right at the very start of an exponential change, and you can sort of tell from the questions and the conversations, we've kind of got an inkling of the future, but we're not really stepping into it yet. But by 2030, decade down the track, it'll be well underway. And the UK, who are way ahead of us, they've reduced their emissions profile by about 42, I think, % below their 1990 levels, whereas ours is 26% above 1990 levels. One of the things that they keep saying to us is that the speed and the cost of the transition is way faster and way cheaper than their most optimistic modelling when they started over a decade ago. And if there was one thing that they could keep imparting to us, it's like, just do your modelling, but don't obsess about it because it's all wrong. And modelling generally always is. But I think there's some real optimism there, and I think that it'll just be a very, very different conversation for this panel, whoever's on it, in 2030.
Brilliant, thank you. Lloyd?
In 2030, we'll be looking back and thinking it was 7 years since the relevant reporting entities produced their first mandatory reports. We'll say, gosh, those first couple of years were painful, but how fantastic that New Zealand was at the forefront and was forced to develop a capability and a model, which meant that now our insights and approaches are being sorted around the world. A little bit the way, 25, 30 years ago, we pioneered reforms in the way government reported its financial position, which then other people around the world have learned from. So we'll be saying, it was worth the pain, and exporting consulting services from New Zealand to help other jurisdictions and economies is now a material part of what we do.
Thank you, Lloyd. Jenny?
Well, I'd like to sort of look in the other direction, I suppose, and say what's changed. And what's changed is here we are in this room talking seriously about decarbonisation. I mean, 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, I can't imagine that happening. I mean, it's incredible. So, I think the pace of change from 10 years ago to now has been huge, and it's just going to get faster and faster. So it is an exciting time, and I feel very optimistic.
Brilliant, thank you. And Joanna?
Yeah, it's always tough going last. Like James, I probably won't be in the same job either. Maybe we can be having a mojito somewhere celebrating. I think that in at least the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see climate risk more properly priced into the cost of capital. Banks and other capital providers are going to be doing that more effectively. So the need for sustainable finance structures won't be there. You won't be able to access capital unless you see all of the risks in the future. And I think, despite all my opening comments around risk, and thank you for balancing them, Lloyd, on the opportunity side, I do actually think that the nature of our economy is going to be fundamentally different. We will have undertaken quite a profound transformation. Even now, you look at organisations, now the acronym is DSM. It was Dutch State Minerals. It was a petrochemical company. It's now a nutrition company. And you've got mining companies that are now EV and tech companies. So how is New Zealand going to leverage its strengths to be quite a transformative economy? And we can be enjoying those mojitos.
And that is a fantastic way to close out and to thank the panel. I'm going to hand formally to Vanya to close the day. But panellists and Minister, really appreciate your sharing your wisdom and your insight and your openness and taking us all on the journey this morning. So on behalf of all of us here, thank you.
Wow, that's a lot to digest. Ka mo te wehi to our fantastic speakers, Minister James Shaw, Jenny Cooper, Lloyd Kavanagh and Joanna Silver, and excellent facilitation, as always, by Richard Clippin of FSC. So perhaps homai te paki paki, another round of applause. Just so many key takeouts, and I guess a pretty basic one is, to keep the conversation going. So maybe at the next barbecue, a starter for 10 could be, did you know that Marlborough's Sauvignon Blanc could one day lose its famed zing if temperatures keep increasing? If you do want to know more, there's just so much guidance, including from the World Economic Forum, the TCFD Research Hub, And from NIWA, on New Zealand specific climate scenarios to identify risks. So as we've touched on, that future focused scenario analysis will be increasingly important, both for corporates and, of course, for sustainable investors. Corporates need to recognise that the more and more measurable impact of climate-related financial risk, both on company and asset valuations, the importance of that. Also important to recognise that there needs to be that ongoing focus on resilience, because businesses really need to create time, space and budget to allow staff to tackle climate risk. And so to close, I will borrow from a speech given by Sir James Bevan, the CE of the Environment Agency in the UK. It's really a neat summary of the most fundamental points we've traversed. Climate change is the biggest risk we face. If we don't tackle it, the consequences are grim. We can tackle it, and we are. And the three most important things we can do are to stop the activities that cause it, enhance our resilience to its effects, and to talk about it. And the financial services industry must make the most of this opportunity to play a leading role in one of the defining issues of our time. So thanks again for joining us today. Do have a great day. Mā te wā.